Good evening, Namaskar. I welcome you all to yet another event in the series IHC Conversation with Author, presented by the Habitat Library and Resource Center, India Habitat Center. The series is started in July 2024, and in a very short time, it has become one of the important events of the IHC's program calendar. We thank IHC President Ambassador Mukherjee for this initiative. Thank you very much, ma'am. On behalf of India Habitat Center, I extend a warm welcome to Mr. Rajiv Mehrotra, whose book, All You Ever Wanted to Know from His Holiness the Dalai Lama on Happiness, Life, Living, and much more, is being discussed this evening. Thank you very much, sir, for making this possible. Mr. Mehrotra is the honorary founding managing trustee of the Foundation for Universal Responsibility of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, established with the Nobel Peace Prize. He has been a personal student of His Holiness for over 40 years. The foundation is non-sectarian, drawing on the sagacity of His Holiness as the embodiment of the Indo-Tibetan civilizational heritage, its wisdom and methods. It offers perspective and responses to contemporary challenges, fostering universal human values that celebrate diversity, cultivate inner peace, and promote global harmony. He was educated at St. Stephen's College, Delhi, and the universities of Oxford and Columbia. He has authored 9 books published in over 50 languages and editions worldwide. His documentary films have garnered over 300 international awards, including 33 national awards from 5 Indian presidents since 1986. Mr. Mehrotra has served as a judge for the Templeton Prize and was recognized as a global leader for tomorrow by the World Economic Forum in Davos. For several decades, he hosted a range of programs on Doordarshan, including his popular series of in-depth interviews in Conversation, the most watched show of its kind at the time. The author, Mr. Mehrotra, will be in conversation with Ambassador Bhashwati Mukherjee, President, India Habitat Center. Thank you, ma'am, for making yourself available for this. Ambassador Bhashwati Mukherjee is a postgraduate first class in history from Delhi University and has a degree superior in French history and civilization from Sorbonne University, France. Ambassador Mukherjee joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1976 and was India's ambassador to UNESCO, Paris from 2004 to 2010, and subsequently India's ambassador to the Netherlands, The Hague, from 2010 to 2013. Ambassador Mukherjee worked successfully on indentured labor route project for UNESCO and Government of Mauritius. She has been a senior consultant to MGIEP, UNESCO, and DFID. She is presently president of India Habitat Center, and she is the first woman president of the center. A prolific writer, she has successfully authored 4 books. India and EU, An Insider View, commissioned by Indian Council of World Affairs in 2018, is a bestseller. Her second book, also a bestseller, was India and EU in a Turbulent World, was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2020. Her third book, Bengal and its Partition, An Inside Story, published by Rupa Publication and released in 2021, is a global bestseller. Her fourth book, Indenture and Its Root, A Relentless Quest for Identity, again published by Rupa Publication, published in 2023, is a bestseller worldwide. She has also published over 100 articles, columns, reports, and monographs in leading national and international publications. A natural orator, Ambassador Mukherjee is a political commentator on TV and Indian culture and civilization, the Indian-EU relationship, Brexit, India's interest in the Indo-Pacific, the chemical weapons regime, nuclear issues, and the changing contours of India's foreign policy, apart from security issues of concern to India. Now, I would like to request the author, Mr. Mehrotra, and Ambassador Bhashwati Mukherjee, President, India Habitat Center, to come onto the dais. And I'll request Ambassador Bashwati Mukherjee, President, India Habitat Center, to take this conversation forward. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Yes, an important announcement. Please switch off your mobile phones or at least put them in silent mode. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shadab. Thank you very much, Rajiv, for agreeing to come and discuss this book. And good evening, all of you who have given so much of support to this initiative of authors, Conversation with Authors, which has actually taken off in such a popular way that I feel that this will continue long after I am gone. It should continue. I hope it will continue. Rajiv and I go back a very long way, more than 50 years, so please don't try to guess our age. We were impoverished students of Delhi University, at least I certainly was. I don't quite know about Rajiv. And we decided to get some extra pocket money by being auditioned for Vani and All India Radio, where we used to get the princely sum of 120 rupees a week. You could only do 7 days in a month. But 120 rupees a week in those days, in the 70s, was enough, more than enough pocket money. We were like rich beyond riches. And that's how we first got to know each other. We used to do these programs together. Rajiv always had a profoundly spiritual side to him, which earned him the respect of all. An early disciple of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, he is now a trustee and the secretary of the Foundation for Universal Responsibility, which was set up from the funds of the Nobel Prize awarded to His Holiness in 1989. We will be in conversation regarding his conversations with the Dalai Lama over the last 25 years. As Rajiv has said, he is a disciple, and he has underlined in his book the special qualities of the Dalai Lama, his empathy, his compassion, and motivation to achieve bodhisattva enlightenment for all beings. And as he has himself said in his book, and I quote, "The Dalai Lama stands tall at the ethical and moral center of an interdependent globalized world because in all that he does, represents and embodies, he reconciles seeming contradictions with remarkable ease." And I noticed that when I was reading the book. We will go through the book together. I will ask him some questions, not that he needs any questions to set him going, but you would find in this book that there are many sections of interest. For myself, of particular interest is the importance of altruism through the control of what we call krodh and hatred, which is so important in today's world. Other topics of great interest in this book are on karma, on reincarnation, on mind training, meditation, politics of conflict and religion, universal responsibility, and the all-important Tibet question. On reincarnation, I found that it is a different approach to Hinduism, and Rajiv had, I remember, explained it when we were doing William Dalrymple's book launch. He touched upon it, but I will ask him to explain it because I found it fascinating. For me, I actually found that the most important part for me, because I'm a single person and I live all alone in a large house with a Labrador for company. The Labrador is called Gora, from Tagore's novel Gora. And he has written on what is called shunyata, emptiness. And what I found very interesting was that the way he describes emptiness and how we feel consciousness and thought through shunyata, through emptiness, how do we achieve it, is very interesting, and it is slightly different from the classical Hindu approach. In other words, do we achieve shunyata through thought or through the absence of thought? That's a very interesting question. Does it take us to a higher level of consciousness? And is it similar or dissimilar to the levels achieved in Hindu practice by deep meditation? That, for me, reading the book was the most interesting part. I'll conclude by saying that as a solitary person who's been solitary now for 25 years, I enjoy solitude. I'm not afraid of solitude. Most of my friends are afraid of solitude. This book will help us to understand and enjoy solitude. I believe that to achieve a higher level of consciousness, one must speak less and think more. Is that shunyata or is that not shunyata? Is something which Rajiv will explain to us. And as one of my favorite poets, Charles William Golding, wrote in his last poem, which was called Silence, and I'll quote, and then remain silent. He said, "Silence is really vital to the human heart. You see, the human heart cannot live with constant sound or noise. It needs silence to heal itself. The only two things that are ultimately required for spiritual homecoming are stillness and silence." And I think I'll end here and we will start our conversation. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.
Good evening and Tashi Delay, everybody. Today is the Tibetan New Year, and the Tashi Delay is the Tibetan greeting. So it's an important, auspicious day, and I feel very special and blessed. I think for several reasons, not the least that this is my first book discussion of anything I have ever written. And the first book that I wrote was, about 20 years ago, which a very indulgent Dalai Lama released. And for all those who were there, and some of them you are still here, it was a very memorable day. And why was it memorable? Of course, that my first book and my teacher, the Dalai Lama, was releasing it at a packed auditorium in the Habitat Center. And so I was full of unholy spiritual pride, and as only His Holiness can do. And I was waiting expectantly for him to start speaking and to start the eulogies that are normally articulated at book releases to authors deserving and undeserving. And so he said, Rajiv works very hard. But how much he knows, I don't know. So it was with great trepidation that I avoided book discussions and book releases around my writings. Well, that's it. That's what I was going to say. And this is also a very special day because at the IIC are a very important trinity for me, who go back as long as Pashwati does. And I see Vidyun Mala Singh, so Vidyun's husband and Vidyun have been very dear friends of ours since we were in college, and she now looks after programs. And I don't know if Suneet Tandon is here. And Suneet Tandon, who's the director of the Habitat Center, and I were also in college together, and we have our office here. So this is like home. And so on behalf of the Habitat Center, thank you for taking time out and for, I think, indulging me. It's always challenging to talk and write about one's teacher. And what's even more challenging is that when you write about it, it is your understanding of what he said, which may not necessarily be what he says. This book was the product of many years, sort of in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s, early 2010, when His Holiness was not as large a figure on the global stage, and he had more time. And so I used to get a fair amount of time with him, and usually 6:30 in the morning, and in his palace, in his house when he was in Dharamsala and in Delhi. And some of the later conversations were recorded, on tape recorders, but they were really reconstituted from notes that I took while he would talk to me. So this book is a product of that process, and very much in the spirit of a somewhat unworthy sadhaka, given the stature of the master, that this book is presented to you. And I thought before we get into sort of the questions around the book, I thought I'll share a little background, if I may, as to what defines and makes the Dalai Lama who he is, and what he says and what he does. Because the book really documents what he says, and we haven't really delved into his biography. And for that, I'm going to step a little back in time to the Buddha himself, because today the Dalai Lama is considered the preeminent Buddhist monk and perhaps the preeminent spiritual master of our times. And he's approaching 90, and he's known personally. His personal name is Tenzin Gyatso, and he's far more than a revered spiritual leader. He's a living bridge between the ancient and the modern. Wisdom and action, suffering and hope, and his life is a testament to the human spirit's boundless resilience and compassion and transformative power. He stands today as humanity's most compelling voice of sanity in an age of madness. And so, for the Buddha, as Prince Siddhartha, and just sort of an interesting contrast, said, the Buddha left the palace to become a mendicant and to start his journey of discovery, and His Holiness, when he was discovered, was taken to a palace, and despite the trappings of the palace, evolved into the person he was. But anyway, I will be brief with words, and brevity is the soul of wit. And so when the Buddha sat underneath the Bodhi tree and meditated and attained what we describe as enlightenment, the question kept coming up for me, what is enlightenment in the first place? And I was to learn from His Holiness, who I consider an embodiment of, or people consider him the embodiment of the Bodhisattva aspect of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, compassion, but that's another story for later. And so what had really happened was that he sat beneath the Bodhi tree and he meditated. And the opportunity will come up to discuss what meditation is. And he experienced the true nature of reality. And what is that true nature of reality? It was articulated as best it could be verbally in the Four Noble Truths, but I won't get into that. But the important thing was that he experienced it. The tradition of Buddhism did not start with verbalization of anything. It started with an experience, and the experience was non-conceptual. And so the Buddha was bewildered that, I have experienced something, I have understood something, I have realized something. Now, how do I communicate this? This was the real challenge. And so he sort of held back for a while and then reached out to the two people who had accompanied him on his quest and began to teach them. Now, what did he teach? He taught them both the method that he had used and the wisdom. Because, and this is very crucial to who His Holiness is and his philosophy and the way he has manifested himself and made himself relevant today. And so there was the method and there was the wisdom. And so it was knowledge and the techniques that helped you realize them. And it is only when you realize through experience and wisdom that your reflex response is impacted. And then it also breeds a kind of humility, because we now know from modern science, which I don't think they formally knew, that the very nature of reality is relative. Reality can be determined by the nature of the observer. We know that by the split experiment and many other, such scientific approaches to reality. And so that is what unfolded. Now, I'll jump from there to the Nalanda tradition, because His Holiness is the inheritor of the Nalanda tradition, and the Nalanda tradition has been touted and talked about, but has not really manifest in the new institutions that have been created. And I would just briefly flag what were the key elements of the Nalanda tradition that His Holiness embodied, and now reflect in who he is, his philosophy and his actions and his impact. So Nalanda was a great university, we know that, and I will not get into its history, but the key elements of the Nalanda tradition was that it was inclusive and it celebrated diversity. So in Nalanda, you had Jains, and you had people from different, the Hindus came in, from different traditions and backgrounds, who engaged in a dialectic process. And why was that dialectic process important? It was because that dialectic process, that debating, was not the kind of competitive debating that we did at St. Stephen's or at Oxford, where you argued to win, to establish a point of view. Here, you were articulating emerging philosophical insights that were then tested for their reason and logic with the community. So it became a clarifying process, and the community was not converted, nor were they hostile. So that was the nature of nurturing inclusiveness and diversity, where we have arrived at the time we cannot even listen to someone, forget to engage in a dialectical process that will enrich us. So that was the key, quite apart from the other elements that they taught, which is classic good education, which we've lost, that there would be art, history, mathematics. Aryabhat was a product of Nalanda, though he was not in the university, etc., etc. It also established another extremely critical aspect for our times, and that was the evolutionary nature of Buddhism. So Buddhism wasn't frozen with the Buddha's experience and wisdom and methods, but continued to evolve. And so along comes Nagarjuna and other great masters in Nalanda, who continue to evolve the manner in which Buddhism could be relevant to its times. And the Shunya idea that you mentioned was really something that Nagarjuna brought into play. And it developed on the core philosophy and ideas of the Buddha to reach out to contemporary predicaments and challenges. Now, it is this basis that has enabled His Holiness, and the details will come up as we go into the discussion, but I wanted to flag this, that enables the Dalai Lama to go to a mosque and perform the namaz. Because that is a notion, that is a particular experience of reality which he respects. And I know that he went to the Ajmer Sharif Dargah, and he prostrated before Khwaja Sahib's tomb. And he lay there for a long time, and I have no idea how many minutes it was, it seemed eternity. He got up and he said, I've experienced the divine. And so I said, but Your Holiness, you're an agnostic. He said, well, I experience what it must feel like to experience the divine. So that is the depth of his openness and his ability to reach out to other faiths and traditions, not merely their wisdom, but their methods as a consequence. And so he has argued and suggested, talked about, I'm just flagging this as the contours of the conversation, as to are there ways in which we could evolve universal values and secular ethics. He has batted for reaching out to India, the Indo-Tibetan civilizational heritage, for the responses it offers to contemporary predicaments and challenges, most notably mental health and training the mind. And this is the tradition that goes back to the Upanishads and the Vedas. And so, again, a little sort of, this is sort of a little checkerboarding. So when the Upanishads and Vedas were articulated from these men who sat in the mountains and assembled them together, they froze the language. They froze the language in order to preserve the authenticity of the teaching. And so the Buddha's, and so the Brahmanical class became the sole custodians and the sole intermediaries to act on your behalf to connect you to God. So they would do the chanting with the authentic pronunciation, and you were supposed to feel connected with the gods. So the Buddha decided he wanted to break through that and hand over that authority for your self-improvement, your evolution, your growth, and to your notion of the divine. And maybe we'll talk about the role of gods, because you see all these Tibetan deities and what role and function do they play. And so that is what is the backdrop to many of the things that His Holiness embodies, his courage in engaging with science, of being able to go around and say that if science disproves some of our beliefs, we will have to accept them. So I just wanted to lay that little framework, and then anything you want to flag, here I am.
Thanks a lot, Rajiv. In fact, you don't really need too many questions from my side. I'll just flag a couple of issues of interest for the audience. You talked about Tibetan deities, and I remember when I was ambassador to UNESCO, I had gone to China for a meeting, and Nirupama Rao was ambassador there, a very good friend of mine. And she gave me a Tibetan deity, which I still have, which looks exactly like Durga Ma, seated on a horse and killing a demon, which is what we in Bengali call Mahishashur, you know. And I asked Nirupama, I said that the Chinese worship Durga Ma. She says, no, it's a Tibetan deity. So it's very interesting, and I'd love you to tell us a little more about that aspect. But more than that, maybe you could take us through some of the things you said when we had the Nalanda debate with regard to the different approach to reincarnation between Buddhism and Hinduism, the whole issue of the Dalai Lama's own succession, the fact that Buddha was an agnostic, but his followers actually, some of them moved on to a different aspect of Buddhism, which I don't know if the Buddha would approve or not.
Let me try and respond to that, and then we'll move on.
And then, okay, yeah.
It's a question that frequently comes up, and I'm going to try and address this as best I can, is that, the Buddha had said that when he was passing away, that, oh, my fellow monks, all my teachings are not definitive or final, and hence the evolutionary aspect, but they must stand up to the scrutiny of reason, logic, and experience. So people are often sort of surprised at the more mystical aspects of not just of Tibetan Buddhism, and then we talk about spirituality, and finally at the spiritual level we are all one, and we're all. So how does the Dalai Lama look at what we call the mystical dimensions? And then I'll come to this issue of deities. And so he seamlessly weaves together reason, logic, and mystical experience, which is what the Buddha was talking about. But in doing so, he demonstrates great intellectual rigor and argues that Buddhist philosophy need not stand in opposition to the deeply felt personal and transformative aspects of spiritual practice. It creates the space for that. And that is one of the reasons, perhaps, why Buddhism evolved into being so easily assimilated, while Hinduism assimilated. So Buddhism was assimilated because it was, how do I put it? It was so flexible and malleable, while retaining its original Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path and what have you, that it was committed to adding value to people's lives, rather than ticking off a box that I am a good Buddhist or a bad Hindu, or vice versa. And so for him, these elements are not separate, but were coexisted, and they were complementary aspects, reason, logic, and experience. And they were crucial in the journey towards enlightenment, as I mentioned, because unless you have both understood it through reason, logic, and experience, it does not impact your reflexive responses. So I could talk till doomsday about why you should not be angry or don't stress. But unless you've engaged in some process that is a deep response, it doesn't change you. Or you begin to interpret it verbally in a manner that is dictated to you by someone else. And His Holiness argued, as I mentioned, that if scientific analysis were to demonstrate in clear, uncertain terms that aspects of Buddhist philosophy, idea, and practice were counterintuitive, he has said, then we must accept the findings of science and abandon those claims. So what he's really saying is that just because science cannot prove reincarnation as we understand it, it doesn't mean that reincarnation doesn't exist, because we know science itself is evolving and has sometimes contradicted its earlier certitude. So he continues to urge followers to embrace their traditions and to move beyond them, embracing a spirit of exploration and intellectual curiosity, evolutionary, dynamic. That's very, very... and also argues that when faith and reason juxtapose, they become an unshakable, powerful force to understand and experience transformation. And he recognizes, of course, that direct mystical experience, cultivated through meditation and mind training practices, plays a crucial role in deepening one's understanding. And it enables practitioners to perceive reality beyond mere conceptual thought. So, for example, a lot of spiritual practitioners will report that they felt this great sense of oneness with the universe. Now, a very core principle of Buddhism is interdependence and interconnectedness. So if you understand interconnectedness and interdependence intellectually, and then through your practice, or whatever it is, mysticism, you actually experience it, then it becomes deep-rooted and enduring, which is why, sort of pharmacological interventions that can give you this sense, whatever drug you've taken, that can give you this sense of inclusiveness and interconnectedness doesn't last, because it doesn't stand up to this aspect of our personalities and being. And so it is important that it must stand up to this process. But he warns us against accepting mystical experience uncritically. So just like we have to use reason and logic to our reasoning understanding process, we must also look at our mystical process and mystical experiences and whether they stand up to that, to reason and logic. So this interconnectedness remains an idea. So if we experience interconnectedness, then we try and come back to reality and say, look, but is that true? So you can both move from reason logic to mystical, from the mystical to reason and logic. And it is then that it really adds substance to our spiritual journey. And then, of course, it says that one of the guiding principles of, time permitting, of His Holiness's philosophy is the idea of compassion. And so, for example, does this mystical experience, one of the criteria to use is, does it nurture compassion? Do we feel more connected or do we feel more isolated? And if it is something that generates a positive, embracing sensation, feeling, conviction, then we are probably on the right track. And does it align with our understanding of impermanence? Things change. So do we get an exaggerated sense of permanence, of solidity? And then it'll be discourage us. So, and I'll just take a little aside, to point out that the three pillars, and we'll come to Shunyata also, is of Buddhist ideas is interdependence and interconnectedness, that we're all interdependent and we are interconnected. The inevitability of change, that everything changes, there is nothing constant. And the third is Shunya. That's a little more complicated. I will try and do that separately and exclusively. So just as wisdom must be paired with compassion for true enlightenment, reason must clarify mystical experience. So now let's look at this whole idea of deity. So in the Buddhist context, does the deity exist or does the deity not exist? Now, in the difference between the Hindu tradition and first let me tell you the similarities, in a sense, that we now know through whether, scientific research that tells us of the impact of color, of forms and shapes, the manner in which they impact our consciousness. I mean, why do you have red light for stop? Why do you feel peaceful when you look at a mountain? So similarly, when you look at certain forms and shapes, it gives you a sense of connect with the emotions that shape or form of the deity evokes in you. And that is why we have preferences of particular deities which are difficult to explain. Somebody just gets a natural affinity to Hanumanji, someone will get it to Ganesh, someone will get it to Lord Ram. Why? It is because our whole psychosomatic process finds comfort in particular forms and shapes. And our philosophical heritage assures us that many of these figures actually existed at some point in the past and are real. And so that reinforces our sense of conviction in their effectiveness. Not so in Buddhism. In Buddhism, and I will sort of scan past Shunya and come to it later. So what happens in Buddhism is that in my case, for example, believe it or not, there was a time when His Holiness felt that I was very timid and I was very shy and reticent. And so he urged me to practice a wrathful deity, just like a wrathful deity you saw, but a very different one. And in order for the form of the deity and the sound of its mantra to be able to impact my consciousness as I concentrated on it, so some of its more subtle qualities were then imbued, or I began to imbibe them. And a very interesting anecdote, related to that. So when you get a transmission in Tibetan Buddhism, the teacher gives you a name. So my name was Pema Wangchen Sa. And Meenakshi and I were traveling in Bhutan, and there was the Dasho that we met, whose name was Pema Wangchen Sha. And this is the only Pema Wangchen Sa that I'd met. And so we got talking. And it turned out that the deity that had been recommended for him was the same deity that had been recommended for me. And it was a very obscure deity, because what His Holiness had done, and this is what teachers have done in the past, and which is why we have so many deities, because deities get tweaked. They get tweaked by great masters, so they begin to match and respond to the sadhak's particular needs. And so you have some common generic deities, but then you have a zillion, infinite number of variations to that. And so we had a very interesting conversation, and because the image that I used when His Holiness gave me transmission, another copy of that didn't exist, but he had one. And so he had me made a copy, and later, of course, His Holiness had a tanka painted so that I could use it. But just to give you a sense of its uniqueness. So in our practice, when we practice on a deity, we first meditate on Shunya. Shunya is a sort of the elephant in the room, and I will talk about it next. We meditate on Shunya, and we generate the deity. So we have something called a generation stage, it's called. So you assemble, you put the deity together, you meditate on it, which means you visualize it, and you chant the mantra associated with it to reinforce the impact on your consciousness, and then you dissolve it. So that is really the principle of the deity in all traditions of visualizations. In our case, because of the idea of Shunya. So let me quickly jump to Shunya. And first, I have to say that I have not experienced it. I understand it intellectually, and it's like the pinnacle of Buddhist practice. So if you finally experience Shunya, then you've literally got it. And so let me try and explain this. So, and there are many semantic challenges to explaining it. which, again, a little aside, which I think His Holiness discovered too late, that when the first generation of Westerners came in and started translating Tibetan text, so even the Four Noble Truths, when the Buddha talks about dukkha, became suffering. It isn't suffering, it's something far more complex, nor is it grasping or craving. It's like I said, if it's non-conceptual, so it cannot be explained. But I think the closest English word is unsatisfactoriness. So when we talk about shunyata, we struggle with that. So the Western translation for it became empty of inherent existence. So it wasn't nihilism, which is what I think most people believe, that shunya means nothing or empty in some form or manner. And the only form of manner is absence of anything. And so Nagarjuna had, and this was the great debate within the Nalanda tradition, that was it nihilistic or not? And there are different grades to that, which I only partially comprehend. But essentially the idea there was born of absolute truth and relative truth. Our equivalent in Hinduism is Maya. This is Maya hai, this is all an illusion, our sitting here, is it real? I mean, as a Buddhist, I would argue when I get up and this table hits me, it's real for me, even if it is within the realm of Maya. So the idea came of two truths, relative truth and absolute truth. So at the level of relative truth, all this is real. And the deity, when I'm meditating on it, is real. But in order to keep reminding ourselves that there is an absolute truth, and what is the absolute truth? The absolute truth is, confirmed by modern science, that everything exists dependent on certain causes and conditions. So we exist on this planet because we still have oxygen. The sun isn't too bright. When that changes, we will cease to exist. So the cause of our continued existence is a balanced environment. Not to speak of food and community and procreation and what have you, and other such conveniences. So the Buddha argued that everything was dependent on causes and conditions, and this links to the idea of interdependence. And so if I were to say to you, here I am sitting at the India Habitat Center, I owe it to three wonderful people. I mentioned that, the Trinity, one of the causes. Then we are sitting here, someone is providing us with air conditioning. Someone has set of water. No, it's not just the water. This is Himalayan water from the hills. So somebody went to some flowing stream, collected the water and put it in a bottle. So every moment, everything we eat, drink, speak, table we sit on, the chair we sit on, has been created and is dependent on certain causes and conditions. An easier example to understand is, let's take ice cream. And ice cream is manufactured. I mean, if you're lucky, it's not blotting paper. It's manufactured with milk and cream or whatever is meant to go in it, and they'll add some fruit and what have you. And in order that, those are the causes that create the ice cream, and it's chilled. Now, the condition that sustains the ice cream is the temperature. Now, the minute it becomes warmer, the ice cream will melt. And you can do what you want. If you just cool it again, it'll taste like frozen milk. Because that whole process of making the ice cream is a complex cause, and the outcome is ice cream. But when the conditions that sustain it, when the causes that sustain it, then it just melts away. So this idea of shunya is really the core. So what it does is that once we understand this emptiness, this absence of an intrinsic, solid self, our sense of self softens. And the minute our sense of self softens, that is the goal of compassion. When we feel compassionate, we don't think of ourselves. Modern psychological testing tells us that when people have mental problems, she handles solitude marvelously. But people who don't or struggle with solitude have an exaggerated sense of themselves, and that's why they suffer. So I've had a little nudge. I'm talking too much. We'll open it up for questions.
I just wanted to make one comment on what you said about you explained the shunyata perfectly. About the deities, I wanted to say that in my understanding as a Bengali Hindu, like when we have Durga Puja, so you have a special chant on the first day of the puja, which begins by saying Jago Ma. And when you say Jago Ma, you are asking the deity to come to life for 5 days so that the followers can worship. And then when we do the Bisarjan, which you had also talked about,
Disillusion.
we have said goodbye, and Ma, who had woken, has gone back to her original place, which is her in-laws, and she would come back next year when we would sing Jagoma. So that's a different way of worshipping from the way you explained to us, and I think it was amazing. we will take questions from the audience, but I wanted you to come to something that is less spiritual and more political, because I would not be doing the audience. Audience would like to ask you in any case. Many have talked about His Holiness's advocacy for Tibetan autonomy rather than complete independence. And he has said, my approach is not separation, but to stay within the People's Republic of China. Now, there are many Tibetans who believe that while they fully understand the spiritual approach behind His Holiness's pronouncements of Tibetan autonomy, they feel that in the long run, it may have encouraged China's oppressive approach to Tibet and its determination to destroy Tibet's unique language, cultural heritage, and religion, and to fill it a little bit like what the Israelis have done in the Gaza and the Western Bank, to fill it with settlers. So they have filled it with Chinese settlers, so that now a very large number of the population of Tibet are Han Chinese brought in to actually, over a period of time, destroy the Tibetan heritage. So you are a disciple, so you might like to explain to us the real reason why His Holiness said this, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
I think this he sought autonomy because it was a practical, pragmatic thing to do. Because in 1959, when he escaped Tibet, there was not a single country, I think, apart from Ecuador or someone who voted in favor of the resolution in the United Nations. India abstained, and it seemed there was no one to support them. And we now know what American support means. They now want to be paid back for their aid to Ukraine. Confirming, I think, the great, obviously, that if the range of options seemed plausible and acceptable, and while Nehru and India have been extremely generous in accommodating His Holiness, and so that the Tibetan community in India are a rare a group of people in human history, refugees who have remained welcomed by their hosts and have retained their identity. It's another matter that's slipping, and 2/3 of those Tibetans have left India now. So the situation is changing very rapidly, and I think he was proved right, because if they had tried the idea of a two-nation settlement, we would not even have had the preservation of Tibetan civilization and culture, which, for His Holiness, was the objective. And also, even today, the Chinese refuse to talk to the Tibetans. For them, it is an issue of the Dalai Lama, and they only wish to talk to the Dalai Lama. And as an antidote to that, the Dalai Lama has abdicated all political authority, not just his, but of the institution of the Dalai Lamas, so that the Tibetan people are now democratically elect their leader and take the call.
Thank you so much, Rajiv. We will take questions from the audience for 15 minutes. We have a mic here, so we'll take 3 questions at a time, if that's okay, Rajiv.
Yes.
Who would like to ask the first question?
I just have a statement.
Okay, can you get a mic here, please? One second. Mic, Dikshe.
I've been to China 4 times. On my 3rd visit, I was walking down the Beijing University down the road, and I wanted to have some soup in a little small restaurant. And I walked in, And there was this lovely Tibetan woman, pink cheeks, and a chubby little boy in her arms. And I said, "Where are you from?" She said, "I'm from the Tibet, Lhasa, but I've come here." I said, "Why did you come here? Don't you have a job there? Is there no restaurant there?" She says, "Well, you know, it's nice here. Beijing is big, and so I've come here to work, and I'm very happy." I said, "You look very happy, certainly." So I'm just wondering, I asked a lot of Tibetans here also, that, you know, Chinese people are not violating you every day of their life, but they are there, they don't want Tibet. They want Tibetans to, of course, get into the Chinese stream. So why are they fighting? Why should you fight? So I found that this solitary woman, there must be many examples of other women, Tibetan women, who've come to Beijing. That's the only one I know. And she was pink cheeks, a very healthy looking, lovely child. And she was happy in Beijing.
We'll take another question over there.
Let's try and keep the questions related. It'll be easier to answer.
Yeah,
But if
yeah.
not, that's
we'll
okay.
We'll take 3, 4 and then you can...
Yes, yes, of course.
I'll come back to spirituality and Shunyata and the main
Okay,
theme
anyone
on
else on any aspect of reincarnation, succession, Tibet?
So Shunyata
yeah.
is going to speak.
So
and then we'll...
I will come back to that. And you know, you once told that you asked Dalai Lama, His Holiness, that, well, I'm not progressing very much in my meditation.
He wants me to spill another truth. All right.
And he said that you keep trying and trying and trying. And so we all keep trying meditation, but beyond a level, there is very little which changes or improves. And what I feel is that the Buddhism has taken a lot of things from Hindu traditions and Hindu culture. The difference being that they don't think of reincarnation. So the meditation should make you reach a certain level in Buddhist tradition. And how do you do it? And what has been your experience? Because you have been one of the very, committed student of the Dalai Lama. Thank you.
Is there any question on reincarnation or spirituality or... yeah, just take the mic. Yeah.
Yeah, the first one was vis-a-vis China and Tibet. I think that's a Chinese international policy wherein we also see the Muslims far up in the north of China. They are also being subjected to
Xinjiang.
certain oppression. So I think it's more of an international policy of theirs rather than just targeting the Tibetans. Secondly, as far as Shunya is concerned, my understanding of Shunya would be vacuum. And vacuum, not emptiness, but vacuum where you go deep within yourself and come to a certain emotional peace and acceptance of the situations as exist and that you have to confront and that you have been confronting. So to that extent, I don't think it's vacuum, but it's self-realization.
We'll take one more question because we're running out of time. There was... yeah, Dediji.
Mr. Mehrotra, in your speech you mentioned that the Nalanda school had a dialectic system of debate where the idea was more to arrive at certain conclusions, or arrive at certain ideas rather than winning as in the modern debating tradition. However, like what we have read about Shankaracharya's debating with Mandan Mishra is very different. So would you like to
Well, that debate was not in the Nalanda tradition, it was in the Hindu tradition, where you outwit someone and the winner takes all.
It's also the Western tradition.
And also the Western tradition, but the Westerners were still probably living in caves, or more or less, at that time. Well, okay.
Is it same as Shastrarth?
Sorry?
Let him answer.
Is it same as Shastrarth? What the Hindu method and others' method is?
The point is that this is not a Hindu versus Buddhist. There is a...
Shastra is also used in our...
Yeah, I mean, there are different traditions which are...
I suggest, Rajiv, you just answer whichever you want, and then we'll take one last 2 more questions.
Okay, so I'll jump into this Tibet issue. It's actually very simple. I mean, for the same reasons that Mr. Trump wants mineral from Ukraine and wants to have a Rivera on Gaza, the Chinese want Tibet. They want Tibet because of its minerals. Geopolitically, all the major rivers coming out of Tibet in South Asia, etc., are in that plateau. So that is the primary reason. And also that, as Mao said, religion is the opium of the masses. So they fear, though Buddhism is not a religion in that sense, so they fear Buddhism, they fear Islam. And this has resonances in many parts of the world, including our country. And as far as the practice of meditation is concerned, I think the protocols are long established, and they have been product tested for thousands of years. So there is a temptation, and I will just, he was referring to a comment, a story that I often narrate, is that, I've been a student of His Holiness for about 40 years, and I used to keep periodically going back to him and saying, Your Holiness, nothing happened, I've been practicing. And for a while he'd just ignore me. And then he said, what's the hurry? Then I went through another phase, which these days is described as spiritual materialism. So, I had a nerve here which used to keep throbbing. And Meenakshi, my wife, would say, oh, that's a nectitating membrane. And so, of course, spiritual vanity, third eye, kundalini. So he goes and he laughs. And he says, this is all hocus pocus. And all these ideas are really holding you back. And don't put a label to anything and keep going. So the truth is that the sadhana, the practice, calls for enormous time and determination, and His Holiness points out, how many hours a day do we spend beautifying our toenails, hoping that someone will look at it, or do up our hair, that someone will notice it on the street, or the clothes we wear, or the time we put in to train ourselves for our careers, to keep physically fit, and we cannot find the time and the discipline to train our minds. And that is the core of it. There's nothing wrong with the technique. It's been proved, product tested, more than any other technique or any other pharmacological intervention or anything that you can do to de-stress or to be more at peace with yourself. Jashi mentioned this idea of being at peace with oneself. Now you have suddenly mindfulness has become a very dominant practice. We consider mindfulness to be a very useful anesthetic. So it prepares you for the more complex processes of analytical meditation, where you actually begin to train the mind so that it begins to think differently.
So we have time for just two more questions. There was a mic to be given there.
Sir,
hold the mic closer to you.
Is that okay?
Yeah,
what I
fine.
wanted to ask, actually, rather than make a comment, is that when I practice meditation, sometimes I'm able to reach that state of timelessness and mindlessness and bodilessness. Sometimes I'm not able to reach that state. Very often I'm not able to reach that state. So does that make a difference? We just keep practicing and it's not important whether you reach there or you don't reach there, or does it actually, every time you can reach there, you're not successful?
One last question. Over here. Just take the mic, please.
One you says you meditate, and other you says you meditate on your impermanence or some specific thing. So what's the difference between those two meditations?
Can you pass the mic to your neighbor and then we'll conclude. Thank you.
To continue on your Tibet question, I just wanted to ask, why are the Chinese so determined to destroy Tibet and Tibetan language and culture? Because somebody told me it is because the Chinese are also Buddhists. Somebody told me there are two different rival sects of Buddhism. And because of this inter-sectarian rivalry, they are trying to destroy the Tibetan religion and culture. Is that correct?
So I'll just hand it back to Rajiv. I'd just like to make one small comment, Rajiv, which is that I remember reading in Mother Teresa's autobiography that she said that for many, many years, she didn't believe in the existence of Christ. She went through that period of disbelief and disappointment in herself. It took her many years of mental discipline to come back to belief. So do you have also something similar in the Buddhist faith? That's my last
And
question.
she gives me 3 minutes. Anyway, 3.5. All right. I think this. I'm going to take 5 because this. The meditation is extremely popular topic, and we're all talking about it. And I do want to answer your question. There are different kinds of meditation, and from the tradition that we come from, there are basically 2. One is called stabilization meditation, where you stabilize the mind. And from there, the techniques of yoga, of breathing, of concentration, or what have you, so that the chitta vritti, the subtle aspects of the mind, learn to focus, which is useful and valuable no matter what you do. Whether it's education, you're a cricketer, you're looking at the ball coming at you 150 miles an hour. So it's called stabilization meditation. It stables the mind. And that is what happens when you experience the peace of stillness or what have you. The mind experiences quietude. And it's like the pond. That, the pebble falls at the pond a little and the ripple at the top settle down, but there's plenty of muck at the bottom. The second kind of meditation is what we call analytical meditation. So in analytical meditation, we pick philosophical ideas, so like impermanence. So we start meditating on impermanence, and we go into a sequential series of questions that we ask ourselves, and then we reflect on that. So the mind becomes familiar with those reflections. Now, what are those reflections? Well, someone I know very well died. And yet, I could die in the next 5 minutes. So the next 30 seconds, I could drop dead here. But I'm going through my life as if I'm going to be eternal. Now, intellectually, the thought might occur. But in analytical meditation, we break it up and we keep familiarizing our mind with it till it becomes a reflex response. It's no different. If I wanted to build up this muscle, I would keep doing this. I would keep repeating it. So the more I repeat that through its permutation and combinations, some of which are prescribed in texts and many of which can be improvised. So I think that, and also this notion of mindlessness. Sorry?
Please don't talk in between. Let him.
Sorry?
Please let's not have a bilateral dialogue. Let him finish, please. Thank you.
Well, just to, so what happens is very often when you think you're failing, you're actually beginning to succeed. So when you think that your mind is now not quiet, the minute you realize your mind is quiet, it stops being quiet. So what is happening is you're making progress because you're now beginning to realize what's happening. And actually, this is a complete misunderstanding of the technique of meditation, that somehow you can reach a stage where you will be thoughtless. At that time, you're deluded. Because it is in the nature of the mind for there to be thought. Sorry. Yes, I have nothing more to say.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that we don't have any books for sale.
Yes, I should just explain this.
But maybe Rajiv will explain that. But and I'd also like to thank you that I think you answered the questions that you can respond to, and maybe you can engage with him bilaterally for the next 5-10 minutes. But thank you all very much. And we are trying to make sure that Rajiv will tell his publisher to get us some books so that we can get it from Amazon or from his publisher, because I've received a lot of messages saying they want this book which you gifted to me. So that would be great if we would one day have some extra copies. There are 2 in the Habitat Library, but that's not enough to fill the demand. Thank you all very much for being here.
Just a brief, the story of the book is that it was published some years ago, and it's been through 20 different languages and editions, and all the publishers collectively decided to withdraw it because it is Holiness's birthday in July, and they are coming up with an expanded 90th anniversary celebration edition of it. And so hopefully in the next month or 2 it should be on Amazon and everywhere else.
Thank you so much. We'll all look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you.